Our speaker to come up here because we want him in the picture.
Bravo, bravo.
You have to stand on here because that's the way the and then you get to take it. But I actually have to talk a little bit about this guy. And first of all, I am Virginia Tippie is my name, and I am the co-chair of the EYC Environmental Committee with our fantastic videographer and AV guy. Stand up, Phil Renaud. Phil Renaud, in his other job, is the executive director of the Living Oceans Foundation.
That's great. Hey.
And it's a great organization, by the way. And in my past life, I'm now retired from the federal government, but I was the director of the National Ocean Service for the United States under NOAA, and I also worked at the White House for many years.
I wish you were still there, Virginia.
I'd let him know. Any rate, but as an oceanographer, really, it is a super pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight. First of all, Dr. Donald Boesch is a professor of marine science and actually a world-renowned oceanographer. And from 1990 until just last year, he served as the president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He's also the vice chancellor for environmental sustainability for the university. Dr. Boesch is one of the nation's most recognized and experienced experts in the application of science to policies for the protection, sustainable use, and the restoration of our coastal ecosystems like the Chesapeake Bay. He's also world-renowned and a national expert on the adaptation to global climate change. He has served on numerous national boards and committees, including the Committee on America's Climate Choices, the National Commission on the BP oil spill, and also as the chair of the National Ocean Studies Board. So at the end of the evening, we've got lots of questions. You can ask him about oil spills, you can ask him about climate change, you can ask him about anything related to the ocean. We really are lucky to have this guy tonight. He has been involved, by the way, in conducting and facilitating research on the Chesapeake Bay for the last 35 years, and he has been an official advisor to federal agencies, the Chesapeake Bay Program, and the 5 Maryland governors. He is a member of the Governor's Chesapeake Bay Cabinet and the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. I just want to add that I happened to be talking to the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Environment from Maryland today, and they were saying, oh, you're having Dr. Donald Boesch tonight? He just got an award yesterday by the legislature. The Maryland legislature recognized him yesterday for his outstanding contribution to the state of Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. Please welcome Dr. Donald Boesch.
Virginia didn't need to do much to convince me to come and talk to you tonight. Yeah, she's a pretty good salesperson. We go way back. We've worked together for many years, and so it's a real pleasure to see not only Virginia, but look at so many old friends who I hadn't seen in years work for Chesapeake Bay Foundation or government and so on, and here at this club. So it's just great to be here. So I'm going to talk, when they ask me what do you want to talk about, I said, well, I'm going to talk about climate change because to me, increasingly, it's the only real deal. I mean, if we don't deal with it, everything else that we're working on, environment, it really doesn't matter that much. It matters, but I mean, it's going to be overwhelmed by climate change. So I made after all of these service and all of these commissions and boards and so on, one of those that I served on was the National Academy of Sciences committee called America's Climate Choices. And this was in the early days of the Obama administration. The study was done because a West Virginia congressman who was asking questions about climate change, with his constituency, put it in the budget. And so we did it. And we thought we were going to miss the mark because there was this meeting in Copenhagen taking place. They were going to develop this big agreement. and then all of our recommendations would be moot. Little we know that not only that didn't happen, but we now back talking about whether we have a problem or not. So I made a pledge to myself then that I'm not going to give a talk about anything without bringing up climate change and the implications of climate change. And of course this one is going to be all about climate change. Now, I always try to take a picture, something that evocative in the opening slide. And this one is you know the planet, right? And watch it. You see that big black spot that goes across the top? You know what that is? It's not the Earth with cancer.
Solar eclipse.
It's the solar eclipse of last year. So it shows you the dimensions of this. Now this is taken from a satellite, which is somewhere out past the moon, looking at the Earth. That satellite was put up, initially conceived to be a permanent place to view the Earth, because the previous image we had was the moon, the trips to the moon, where they looked back at Earth and had this blue marble. And so Al Gore actually had the idea we need this permanent satellite out there that was taking measurements and looking back at Earth so we can always view ourselves. I'm not going to be too political, except about climate change. I'm going to be very political. The George W. Bush administration canceled that satellite mission. When Obama got back in, he says we got to do it, we got to update it because we have a lot more technology and instrumentation, so it's got put up. Do you know what I heard today from someone at UMBC who is working on this, the instrument that went up in this satellite? The President administration, this satellite is now out past the moon and it's looking both at the Earth and it's looking at the sun because it's measuring the incoming radiation from the sun and how it varies. President administration is planning to turn off the looking at the Earth. So, anyway.
Excuse me, what's the name of the satellite?
I don't, this was called Discover, but it's got another technical name now. But if you go DSCOVR, Google that, you'll find this. So, you gave me the clicker, I have it here somewhere. So that's trying to get you to look at this, look at the beautiful planet we live on. God, it's a special place, right? So, global warming is occurring. There's no doubt about it. And even now, the doubters, are saying, yes, it's occurring, but we don't know exactly why. It could be natural factors, warmed in the past, and that sort of thing. But first order, global warming is occurring. This is the temperature, this is the average temperature of the Earth, both the air at the surface of the Earth as well as in the surface of the ocean, averaged over the whole globe. These data are from NASA. There's several agencies that do this. And NASA's data shows that if you look carefully, you'll see this includes the 2017 data, which are all included. And you can see 2017 is the second warmest year on record, in this record. NOAA has a similar data set, and they do the calculation a little bit different. With NOAA's data, it's the third, just behind 2015. 2016 was the warmest. 2015 and 2016 were El Nino years, affected by this dynamic in the Pacific Ocean, where the warmth comes up from the ocean into the ocean and releases a lot of heat to the atmosphere. Those years are warmer than usual. So 1998 was a big El Nino year, so you can see how it peaked. So this is the warmest, last year was the warmest non-El Nino year ever. It's also the year in which the measured, calculated, greatest amount of heat is increased in the ocean. Now the ocean's pretty important because it's where most of the heat is stored. And And that record is pretty continuous of just warming, warming, warming. But you know, this other record is variable. So some years ago, there was this great talk about, well, global warming has stopped. It stopped after 1998, and it kind of went down, and it's been stable. So, hey, look, the problem is not what we thought it was. But if you step back and look at the whole record, it's not even a pause. It's the part of the natural variation in cycles that we have, things like El Nino and so on. So now, even scientists were questioning, why did we have this pause? But after it picked up again in 94, in 2014, 15, 16, and so on, there's no question that really it's just variation. It's just the noise, the signal is unremitting warming. So there should be no question about it. Ted Cruz still questions it because he raises the satellite data set, which shows that, doesn't show this. But if you add the most recent data and do the proper calculations, even the satellite data show that this is the case. The satellite data are only part of the information we have because it's measuring the top of the atmosphere. And these are measurements of the surface. The satellite data haven't warmed as much because the satellite, the top of the atmosphere is where the cap is of the greenhouse effect. And so you don't see the effect as much as you do on the surface. So anyway, no one is denying that it's warming. In addition, have you noticed? We've had these extreme events. And we've always had extreme events, and we will always have extreme events. But these are extraordinarily extreme. So here in Hurricane Harvey, Texas, Houston, Texas had 60 inches of rain. That's well beyond anything we've experienced. And here, of course, we have this year these wildfires in the west and encroaching on where people live in Southern California. Scientists have become, and the typical response of a responsible scientist is that we can't say that these events were caused by global warming. We can say that it's increased the probability that these events occurred. Now, scientists are very cautious and conservative. Now, of course, the science is advanced that we can actually tease out what is the effect of this warming as opposed to natural factors. And what we're seeing is that in Houston, for example, the coincidence of a blocking high pressure that kept that hurricane dancing around Texas was always there. We could have been more affected by the warming that we've had, but that the surface waters of the Gulf were anomalously high. And that's what provided the moisture and the heat energy that drives this big engine that we call a hurricane. And if you factor that in, at least 20% of that rainfall, that extreme rainfall, was, we could attribute at least that much to the warming effect. Similar with these wildfires that we're having. So we're seeing now, and to be honest about it, because of the natural conservatism of scientists, some of these are happening in a more extreme way and faster than even scientists predicted. So these are the things that really catch our attention, and there's always debate about it. Pay attention to these. There is hype about it, media hype, but these increasing floods, extreme events, fires, and so on, are a signal of this changing climate of ours. So, as I said, even the folks in the Trump administration are agreeing that the world is warming. So here's Scott Pruitt, our secretary, our administrator of EPA, who said multiple times, actually said again just earlier this week, I would not agree that carbon dioxide is the primary contributor to global warming that we see. We don't know that yet. We need to continue the debate and the analysis. Well, somehow, he's already there with scientists surrounding EPA. He knows, he's been told, the science is pretty clear. Science is represented right there in that other graph. This is a report presented and released by the White House just this year, which says basically human causes of the warming contribute to virtually all of the warming. All of it, not just primary. And I mentioned that because we were talking local politics here with my good friend Beth. And I got to tell you, you probably some residents in this district and so on. I was queried. We were at a bill hearing
Right.
about Maryland joining the U.S. Climate Alliance with other states, which, to his great credit, Governor Hogan has done, which is great. So we're going to put they're going to build in the governor supporting the bill to put it in statute as well. So one of the questioners I had from members of the committee, the Environment and Natural Resources, was from Delegate McMillan.
Oh.
And he said, I'm very glad you said primary, because it doesn't mean that all the causes. And I said, sorry, it's all of it. So what is causing this, all the factors that are causing warming? This is a complex slide for lay people, but it's not that complex, actually. We know that a lot of things that affect the temperature of the Earth. And one of them, of course, is solar input. We get cycles where there's more sun energy coming in, and obviously that causes more warming. As solar activity decreases, it's less so. So you see the little yellow-orangish line there? That's solar activity that changes. Very small. Get this picture in your mind, and you'll come back to it. I said, very small.
Yeah.
And some of the other things, we've actually increased the ozone concentrations on Earth and in the stratosphere, reduced those in the stratosphere, that action have an effect. We know that volcanoes, because volcanoes spew all this dust up and it travels around the Earth, it shades the Earth, so it causes lowers the temperature. What else have we got? Ozone, the volcanoes. Land use. We've changed the way the land is configured, so we have less forest, a lighter surface. We get more reflection of the light back out, so that's a factor. Put all those in place, and then of course there's this greenhouse gases that we talk about. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So you can see each of those individual factors, what would they be? How would they affect temperature? And 2 points I want to make is that, first of all, the other factors are kind of small. Oh, the bottom one is important too, because that's human effect. That's aerosols, the fine particles that we submit into the atmosphere from burning fuels and things of that sort. That actually has a shading effect. So it's reducing the warming because of the pollution. Here's pollution reducing the warming. So it's only when we add those together and put them in the models that calculate the effects that you can explain the dots. Connecting the dots, that's the warming trend. And the other thing about it, that hindcast, if you will, of the warming trend, is done by sophisticated computer models. And those computer models work. They hit it pretty much spot on. So there are two important things. There's more greenhouse gas effect, more than enough to explain the warming. It's counteracted by the other factors. And we know we have a pretty precise calculation of how that warming takes place. Another question Delegate McMillan asked me was, yes, he did. He said, we all know that climate is changing, and we know that back in the medieval period there was this warm period. And of course there was a cold period too, the medieval cold period that took place. You know, and that affected things, because in the warm period they were growing grapes in Great Britain. They're going to grow grapes again. They're growing grapes again in Great Britain. And we had the little ice age and so on. So yes, we know that there are other factors that go on that affect the Earth. But what we see here, this is not usual. Folks, this is unusual. This is where we are, the red line is. We're out of the bounds that we're seeing that's caused by natural factors. This is, if anything, a wake-up call. So the greenhouse gas effect. I can give you a whole lecture on this. Some of you would be enthralled, some of you would be bored. But basically, as the light comes in from the sun into the Earth, some of it is reflected back out. Some of it is absorbed, and some of that is reflected back out. And it's that light that's leaving Earth, that energy that's leaving Earth, which is trapped by these gases. There are a limited number of gases. Carbon dioxide is one, and the most important one. It also includes methane, compound we know, because if you have a natural gas stove or use natural gas for heating and so on, that's almost all methane. Includes ozone, includes water vapor, nitrous oxide, other kinds of these gases that have a particular molecular propensity. When they get infrared radiation, they wiggle, and it heats up the atmosphere. And so they trap that air, like a greenhouse would, down in the surface layer of the Earth. We knew about this. We've known about this for more than 150 years. This, what we see now, is not a surprise. It would be a great surprise if the Earth wasn't warming. Because as we can see, here's the record, the instrumental record that we have for carbon dioxide at the top of Mauna Loa in the big island of Hawaii, chosen to be away from other sources and up. And you can see it's unremittingly increasing. It has the sawtooth pattern, which I think is a wonderful metaphor. The Earth is breathing. The concentrations of carbon dioxide go down in the northern hemisphere during the summer when the plants are taking CO2. Remember photosynthesis in high school biology? Come on, right? Taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they're being released when there's little photosynthesis, and it's all respiration. We're breathing out CO2. So this is the breath of the planet, and you can see it's breathing pretty heavily, and it's going up. This is just what, yesterday, from Mauna Loa. 400. We always said, well, we got to 400 ppm. We're 408 ppm. We're never going back below 400 again. Not many lifetimes. So the other thing is that what happened, so that's what's happened now. What's going to happen to the future? People say, well, there's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of variability. It could be this, it could be that. Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I haven't shown you here, except in this one temperature. Scientists are pretty good at statistically expressing that range of variation. It could be within this bounds, 90% possibility, that sort of thing. But so the main determinant of how warm it will get is us. It's not the planet and all the things about the natural system that we don't know about. The main determinant is us. So here is what we've done, the scientific community through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Basically took several scenarios about the future. One of which, and I'll call here for simplicity, it's not quite accurate, but I'll call business as usual. That is, you look at the top curve, this kind of dark red curve. That's the higher scenario, and it's called 8.5. It doesn't mean anything to you, but here is the emissions of carbon dioxide. So here's where we are. This is where we've been in terms of the CO2 concentrations, the black line. So if we continue that trend, and the emissions of carbon dioxide continue to grow until the end of the century, we finally wake up and we say, whoops, and we've got to stop. And see, it stops and then levels off and will go down the next century. That's the business as usual scenario. I don't talk about the middle ones. The bottom scenario was particularly put together to see what kinds of how emissions would have to stop and how they would have to change if we were to keep the warming of the planet, average temperature over the whole planet, less than 2 degrees Celsius. Why 2 degrees Celsius? Well, a whole bunch of other studies have shown that things really go haywire beyond 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius still provides a lot of changes that we have to contend with. But when you get out of the territory, you got some really crazy things that are going to happen that are irreversible, like large-scale extinctions of species all over the world, like unleashed sea level rise. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So that was the basis of the Paris Agreement, which you heard about back in 2015. That is, we commit to take action so that warming doesn't increase. We have a reasonable probability that warming won't increase to the global average temperature of more than 2 degrees C over pre-industrial levels. Where are we now? Anyone know?
Yeah. No, I want you to tell me.
We've warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. So this is not something you can put on the brakes. First of all, the natural system, has a lag, has an inertia. So even if we stop tomorrow, reduce emitting any greenhouse gases, the planet would still warm. Because it's built, remember that all that heat I told you was stored in the ocean and so on. So there's that, but this other thing is that we can't do that. We can't stop emitting CO2 tomorrow, greenhouse gases tomorrow, right? What will we do? I couldn't drive home. No, I actually have an electric car. No, but my electric car is dependent upon the electricity I stored from fossil fuel generated or nuclear generated power somewhere anyway. So this is unfeasible. So we have to then think about what are the alternatives? How can we slow this down and turn it around? So this scenario here, in terms of the bottom green one, is the emissions that would have to be achieved to keep it to the point where global mean temperature had a really reasonable statistical probability of keeping below 2 degrees C. That was the basis of the Paris Agreement. That's the heart and soul of the Paris Agreement. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to it in the next slide, I think. No, not just one. So one of the things, since we're here, living here, enjoying the fact that we live on the water, on the bay, and sail, and it's a delightful amenity that the Earth has given us, but we know that sea level is rising. And so what's going to happen to, say, sea level, depending upon these scenarios? Well, again, I want to show you the two extremes, business as usual versus Paris Agreement scenario. This is recent work done by a very gifted young man. He's still young, he's still in his 30s, but he's very distinctive professor at Rutgers by the name of Kopp, Robert Kopp. Does that name sound
Oh,
familiar?
yes. That's Nancy Kopp's
Nancy
son.
Kopp's son. Nancy Kopp, our
my
state
gosh.
treasurer's son.
Wow.
He then collaborated with the scientists who were working on the glaciers in Antarctica, who had produced this new findings about the instability, potential instability of these ice shelves. You see over there, and I can't go over there and point to them because I've got to be on the camera. Next time, afford some makeup artist. You know? So you see here that what's happening in Antarctica is you got these huge, massive cliffs and they're falling into the ocean. The reason is that not the air is warming, but the ocean's warming ever so slightly. So you got the ocean waters under them that are melting the water, melting the ice, and that's causing this. So those shelves are kind of sitting on a foundation. Ultimately, they sit on rock. And it erodes back to the point where they're sitting on rock, and then you have the whole possibility of a massive or very rapid reduction of the ice as those big glaciers slide into the ocean. So they've put together these two bits of information, and a lot of highly technical graphs that I could explain to you, but I won't. The bottom lines are up in the top, the red and green numbers. So if we are in pursue business as usual, global sea level rise, and mind you, I won't go into depth about this, but that means here at Annapolis, our sea level rise is going to be a bit higher than that because the land is sinking. I always pause here. Can you feel it? It's sinking. It's sinking because of the effects, the long-term effects of glaciation to the north of us, pushed down the rock, pushed us up. Glaciers are gone, we're going down. So add a few feet, make it, round it off to 4. If we don't do this, if we let greenhouse gases go, best estimate, this is a central estimate, and there's a high range and low range, of about 4 feet of sea level here. Where's the property manager? Decided where it is? 4 feet of sea level. If, however, we actually did what the U.S. signed on to, and all the other nations except 2, and now those nations have signed on to it at the time we're leaving, Nicaragua and Syria, good company. We could hold that to about less than 2 feet. So it's a big difference here locally, but it's, the rest of the world says 2 feet. Big deal about sea level rise. The point I want to make here is this tipping point thing. If we have business as usual through this century, their best estimate, mean probability, at the end of 2200 That seems like a long time, but Annapolis has been around here a lot longer than that. 2,224 feet.
Oh,
You know, Eastport ceased to exist.
wow.
Okay? By the end of 2300, that's after we woke up at the end of this century and stopped emitting greenhouse gases. It's too late. Those suckers are coming down. They're melting. 38 feet. If we did the Paris Agreement, the good news is, if we did the Paris Agreement, end of next century, 3.6 feet. We could probably manage that. We got 120 years, 80 years, something like that. We can probably manage how to figure out how to deal with that. 2,300, 4.7 feet. So this is the sort of thing, if you heat it up to a point, you get to this tipping point where things you can't do, choices you can't make in the future. You can only make those choices today. So my grandkids, by the time they are adults, they won't have a choice to say, we can stop this then, because it's already decided. Okay? That's the reality of it. So we really have, and this is the theme of the talk, we have to do both. We have to, what we call mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means slowing climate change, slowing global warming. And adaptation is adapting to the fact that we've already changed the climate and it's going to be changing despite what we do. We need to avoid the unmanageable situation, that 24-foot scenario, but at the same time we need to remember that even in this century we need to manage the unavoidable. Here in Annapolis, right? We need to deal with that. So these are the Paris Agreement targets. And I'll show you the slide that says what the agreement says, the 2 degrees C. But at the end of the day, when they were putting that together and coming to agreement, there was a lot of anxiety in Paris about, geez, that's already 2 degrees C is going to cause a lot of problems. And so maybe we should say, well, we're going to try for 1.5, right? Limit 1.5. We're already at 1, so it's going to be tough if not impossible. The Paris Agreement says we're going to strengthen global response to the threat of climate change by keeping the global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. And we're even further to 1.5 degrees. Now, unlike previous efforts, there is no international mandate to do it. Basically, all the nations agreed to that, and then they offered their own plan, the first installment about how to get there. So these, what are called intended nationally determined contributions, each nation state had to do it given the fact that they have different circumstances. So developing nations said, we're going to have to keep emitting greenhouse gases for a while because we've got to bring our development up, but ultimately we're going to find a way to reduce it. So the time frames changed and so on. This is what President Trump's called, we got a bad deal.
Oh.
So I can't read it from here, but you can look at the difference between 1.5 and 2.2 degree. What it would mean for us, well, later this century, I'm going to be gone, but in terms of the temperature range. But the important thing here is look at tell me what it says about corals. Beth, read that.
90%.
Right. So even at 1.5, we're going to lose most of the corals of this planet and all the biodiversity in there. So that tipping point has already been crossed, basically. So we have to kind of control the damage as possible. So it's crunch time, folks. We don't have time to waste. We don't have time for this stuff. Here is a representation of what the problem is that scientists have then said if we get to this, we have to basically get to zero net carbon emissions, which means that we have to be, even if we're emitting some CO2 and other greenhouse gases, we have to have things in place to remove some of it, whether it's by growing more forest or capturing the waste streams of CO2 and injecting it in the earth or something. We're going to have to offset that. And we're going to have to do that with this steep curve. And the longer we wait, even in terms of a few years, the harder it's going to be and the steeper that cliff is going to have to be if we're going to achieve this. So what this analysis tells us is that we've got to do it by 2050. Now, this is 2018, right? So we've got 2. So that's like 32 years from now. So imagine what 2 or 3 years means in terms of our ability. This is the whole world. Okay? This is not just the U.S. So the U.S., its intended commitment, contribution, I showed you there, it's about 28, we're going to be ambitious, 28% reduction of our emissions from the U.S. And you should know that the way the rest of the world sees the U.S. is compared to what some of us see the U.S. in terms of responsibility. They think it's all our problem, all our fault, because most of that CO2 in the atmosphere, not most, but a large, yeah, probably most, the majority of it, it's got made in the USA written on it. And it's there for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So you're going to tell me you got all of that and I can't burn this stuff? What? You know? So that's the nature of the problem. So you can see that we've had a reduction because of efficiency, because of the switch from coal, clean, beautiful coal, you know? Beautiful clean coal, anyway. The switch from coal. We've done it mostly for economic reasons, and we're switching to using natural gas. And also part of that downturn in our emissions is the recession. Good on us, right? We had a recession. And you can see the projection for this coming year for the U.S. Energy Agency is actually we probably might increase this year. So we potentially going the wrong. But even then, if you can't see, if we're then by 2020, which was supposed to be our goal, 2025 is the goal, we got to get to zero. In the trajectory, the slope in the trajectory is not the right one. It needs to be headed down much more rapidly. So here's good news. Well, relatively good news. We in Maryland get it, right? So, despite my questions in the Committee of the General Assembly, we live in a state where we have a divided government. We have a Republican governor who signed the greenhouse gas reduction, who is now, somewhat reluctantly perhaps, but has now agreed to join the Climate Alliance. Why did Larry Hogan do that?
Get reelected.
Well, first of all, he had good advice. He has a Secretary of the Environment who's committed, who understands it, and he can sit down and the governor explain it. But you're right, the governor did it because in Maryland it's good politics, right? Well, that's right. That's okay. We'll take it, you know.
Yeah, right.
So we have even before O'Malley, or in the O'Malley areas, we have a number of things that have contributed to our reduction of emissions. Because as we'll point out, we have a similar goal. We have a clean cars legislation that required us to use to only sell cars which have the same California emission standards, efficiency standards that reduced our emissions. Maryland joined the Greenhouse Gas Initiative that regulates, that has an effect on the amount of CO2 you can emit from power plants. In a regional compact, the northeastern states, you know that, Reggie? And I'll talk about Reggie. Well, I should talk about Reggie now, as I haven't shown a slide. Maryland joined Reggie. There's a question about just last year whether Hogan was going to continue it. Fact of the matter is, through the work of Ben Grumbles, the Secretary of the Environment, they not only stayed in the game, but actually taken the next step. In addition to that, just yesterday, newly elected Governor Murphy announced that New Jersey, which was drawn from the regional compact by Chris Christie, is back in. Yes. We expect there's a good probability he's going to have the arm wrestle with their General Assembly, but Governor Northam from Virginia is going to join in. So we'll have from Virginia all the way up to the top of the Northeast, with the big hole in the middle as being Pennsylvania. All part of this regional cap and trade system, finding efficient ways to produce our power in a more effective way. We have another law that requires forces a reduction of electricity consumption through conservation and so on. A number of things. So when O'Malley was governor, end of his first term, there was an effort in the General Assembly to pass a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. Senator Pinsky and others didn't pass. But O'Malley then said, I got to figure this out. It was new to him, frankly. He knew a lot about potholes and police and things of that from Baltimore, but this was new to him. And he formed a commission, which basically I've been on since the beginning, which basically says, what do we do? That's sort of a plan. And what we did is to produce the report in 2008 to tell the governor and the General Assembly, what you should do make a commitment to reducing our emissions in statute. So in 2009, we passed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, which said by 2000, it's 2 years, a little over two years away, more or less, we're gonna reduce our emissions by 25%. Guess what, folks? We have a reasonable prospect. We're on the right trajectory. You got to keep focusing on efforts, helped by the recession, some other things, but we're on the trajectory to do that. So, at the end of the O'Malley years, the last year, the commission had kind of done its work and was moribund, and there were some of us, Nancy Kopp and John Griffin and I, were trying to get the governor to say, let's get this thing reactivated because, you know, the lieutenant governor, when he's elected, he's not aware of this. We need to get some momentum. Well, guess what happened? So there was a great degree of concern that Governor Hogan would come in, and this was all done by executive order, the commission, and just let it go kaput. I talked with Ben Grumbles. I said, that would be a real mistake. We need to do it. So that year, sure enough, the General Assembly said, we're going to put it in statute, challenge the governor. The governor signed that bill. So the commission, now we have a 2016, the commission became a legitimate, supported by the administration, but also by statute, broader membership, and so it committed to it made a recommendation that was adopted in 2016 for a 40% reduction by 2030. So at least in terms of Maryland's public policy, you know, we are among the leaders, and particularly in a bipartisan way, which I think is probably. Now, that's making a commitment is one thing, getting there is something else, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. One of those things, at the very session, 2016, that Governor Hogan signed, his second bill that he signed that year, Beth, was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. One of the last bills that he vetoed, by the time summer rolled around, was a bill that would increase the renewable portfolio standard, which is basically saying that if you're generating electricity, a certain percentage has to be from renewable energy. So that raised the percentage to 25%. He vetoed it, said it was a tax on consumers. So goals and means are two different things. This year, there's going to be legislation that's going to try to push it to 50%. The General Assembly came back in 2017 and overrode the bill, so it is law. We're going to try to push that to 2050. So even though we have agreement on what we need to do generally, there's still going to be push and shove that you guys can be part of in Annapolis here to figure out what we do. And I said, just a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, Governor Hogan announced that he was joining the Climate Alliance. The Climate Alliance was something set up by Governor Cuomo and Governor Brown from New York and California, and a few other states, that basically said, after the Paris Agreement says, well, if Trump's not in, we're still in. We're going to do our part to meet it. So it has power. It has power in terms of the. It now represents, with Maryland joining, and presuming New Jersey joined, about 43% of the U.S. public live in those states, 15 states, Puerto Rico included. We can do things. We can pass laws. We can learn from each other. We can do regional compacts like we've done here. One of them that's under discussion is transportation. That's the area that emissions are continuing to grow. So if we thought collectively, because roads don't stop at the borders of Maryland and Pennsylvania or Virginia, how we manage the whole transportation infrastructure and vehicles and charging stations and that sort of thing. We do things collectively. So that's a very good move, a step forward. Meanwhile, remember I said pay attention? Now I'm not talking about the size, I wasn't talking about the size of his hands. This is when he announced. His point was that it would make a very little difference. So how, either ill-informed or ill-advised he is. So he announced the intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Just the other day said he would join it if he'd love to join it. He said love to join it if it was a good deal, whatever that is. They're denying, purging, if you watch the agencies. The climate change is disappearing from websites
Yeah.
and like crazy, and any reference to it bothers me most is undermining science by removing, intimidating science, but also removing the scientific input to these processes. Selection of advisors, independent advisors. I spent a whole second career volunteering my time on various things. And now since I actually I received some grant money from EPA, I can't advise EPA because of the way they've constructed it. Funding is a real issue. Just today, I saw in the news that we need to go to renewable energy, right? So there's this big program, in the Department of Energy to fund research on renewable energy, our future. Proposed 72% cut.
Yeah.
Fracking emissions, you know about that controversy. They want to deregulate. They don't put the regulations that were developed in place. Announcing a tariff on solar panels, imported solar panels. When there are more jobs to be lost by people who install those panels than potentially developed by manufacturing here. We like to manufacture them here, but we've got an urgent problem that we need to move forward on. And even, I'll put this in after thinking about Texas and going quickly to the last topic of adapting to the changes. I won't say much more about it. Is just at the time that the Texas floods, they withdrew the FEMA rules that basically said you need to change the requirements for flood insurance because of the realistic flood risk and the changing flood risk. They pulled those back. So what does that mean? I don't know. So I think I decided to focus really on just trying to slow the global warming. It's the most urgent thing we can do. But there are a whole variety of things that we need to do in a whole variety of sectors and levels to adapt to the changes that we already have and that are going to happen even if we did the Paris Agreement and fulfill the bargain. And of course here in Annapolis everyone's focused on nuisance flooding, that city dock is underwater more frequently. Here's the data that shows the number of days in which we have roads that are flooded here in Annapolis due to tidal flooding. And you can project that into the future and see some of the areas are going to have some severe problems. I just grabbed this. This is a website. You can go to Climate Central, and you can tune in on the map and see where you live and look at how water levels would vary. I just chose this as a 10 feet because that's the highest it showed. But that's not extreme because on top of the effect of sea level rise, we have to figure storm surge. So in Annapolis during Hurricane Isabel, we had a 7 or 8 foot, 9 foot sea level storm surge alone. So here you can just look at what it would mean, and I meant to put a little arrow said you are here, where the Yacht Club is, you know where you are. But you can see Eastport becomes an island rather than a peninsula. Okay, in that future. So folks, we're into very serious challenges ahead. It's really comforting. I talked to a lot of groups, citizen groups and so on, and so many people are aware of this and concerned about it. It really is our existential challenge of our generation. Looking around the audience, I know there are people who are more or less my age and who think about this in terms of, it's really important. It's affected me very personally, even though I'm a scientist and supposed to be objective and look at the data. Think about it in the eyes of your grandchildren, what they have to deal with. Are we leaving this mess to them? We need to really take action to address it. So thank you so much.
I'm sure there's some questions for Don. Bill?
The Climate Alliance, the states that are participating in that, is it true that if they meet their goals collectively, it would essentially equal the goal or the target for the United States in the Paris Agreement?
I think the intended agreement, the basis of the agreement, this was all done quickly and in response to it, and it just 3 weeks ago hired a director, so I didn't have a staff and so on. But the intent is that the 28% by 2025, that was part of the U.S. commitment. They said we're going to do at least that. And that's just the first installment. So there's now discussions, like 7 different work groups on issues where there's discussion of best practices and legislation and other things that are going on within those states, that you're going to see this process mature. Now that you have some other states joining it, even and it's tenuous. I mean, it's a delicate agreement, because among the states that have joined it, Governor of North Carolina, who's a Democrat elected against all odds, there, his defeated incumbent, he signed it, but he doesn't have support of his General Assembly legislature to do that. So it varies on the state. On the other hand, California, take that, they're going well beyond those kinds of levels. They're taking it to a much deeper level. So I think that's in political science, they call this the leader-laggard phenomenon. So you need some leaders to bring the laggards along. So one of the bits of discussion I've had with Secretary Grubbles and some others is that how do you reach out to other states? Even if their politics say they can't join this alliance, there's still things that we're learning that could affect those states and improve those states. Yeah.
So maybe we should change our name to Eastport Sailing Club, so get away from those fossil fuels. I'm just kidding. We went to a presentation last week at the Maritime Museum about the geological history of Chesapeake Bay, and the meteorite that crashed into the bay, created the bay. But this geologist claimed that we're actually on a cooling trend geologically. And so obviously that's a long-term process of millions of years, but so it's interesting that the Earth is heating up even though we're geologically entering a cooling phase.
Right. So since the middle of the 19th century, the temperature has been cooling slowly. So it is reversing that and then some. You're right. The other thing is that the big game changer, of course, is the cycles that cause the ice ages, and we are still sitting thousands of years away from when that would probably take place and cause them, glacial periods is the other problem. And that actually, what we're doing today is going to have an effect on that, because that's very much governed not only by the wobbles of the Earth and how it affects solar radiation, but the greenhouse gases play a big role in those ice age. The gases that are stored in the ocean during cooler periods. When it warms, they're released into the atmosphere. That really drive the warming and deglaciation that takes place at the end of ice ages.
Any other questions? Phil in and Ann.
Don, I don't have any questions, but I have 2 points. So
I'm sorry, next question.
I think the first point is youth is going to drive solutions. So I just got back from Saudi Arabia. That crown prince over there, Mohammed bin Salman, is very visionary. He's made all these decrees that all buildings are going to be sustainable, all power in these future developments is all going to be renewable, solar and wind, no effluent into the ocean. Amazing. And so that's very shocking to me that this Saudi Arabian new leader, the fossil fuel capital of the world, is driving these new sustainable decrees. That's awesome. And then I think the second point is that humans respond to a crisis, right? We're going to get into a crisis in these next 10, 20 years. You look at what's happening in Florida and Louisiana and stuff. We are going to get into a crisis mode in the next decade or so, and it's going to force leaders to react very aggressively. So I just want to say that I know this is a very dire situation, but I think between the power of youth and the power of humans responding to a crisis, I think we'll see some big movement in the future.
Yeah, I agree with you. My only concern about the second point is whether we finally wake up and deal with the crisis before it's too late.
Right.
Did you wake up? Yes.
Oh, that's it.
We had this one, Ann.
We live in an area where there's a lot of the military, and I think it's important to recognize that although many of the departments in the current administration are cutting back on efforts to address climate change, that the military is recognizing very much the problems that their bases and their operations are going to face with climate change.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. First of all, there are two contrary signs of how the military is responding. One, report just this week again on climate change threats to military facilities around the world. It mentions Annapolis in particular, the Naval Academy in particular. The other is that even though the leadership of the military finally, got it and saw this as a threat, military threat, not only a threat to their bases, but a threat to instability that's going to lead to conflict. It was identified, but in the new National Defense Review, is that what it's called? Because of the administration, it's not mentioned. So,
Can't say the word.
Right.
I can't say much.
How do you put population, oh, sorry, I
Someone
thought you
over
looked at
here.
me.
Yeah, we had some. Your question.
So, the population today, and we went up to 2,300, by that time, if we go along we are now, it's 100 billion people, like it doubles every 50 years. There's no talk about that, and the problem isn't the government, the problem is people. Like,
Right.
everybody who drove a car here tonight, families that have 2 cars. So the government can make a lot of rules, and it would be great for it to happen, but how many people would accept a rule that said you can only drive, if your license plate, if it's an odd number, you drive on odd days? And, I mean, it would take some tough things, and how do you deal with the 100 billion people?
well, the population growth is indeed part of the problem. It's not the only part of the problem because it's consumption rates per population that also drive it. So you need to work on both. I'm not an expert in population control. Most of what I've read said that, for a variety of internal reasons related to education of women and a whole bunch of other things, that population is going to stop growing and level off sometime in this century, 10 billion people or so. But but indeed that helps drive the problem. And the second thing, freedom. It's just another word for nothing left to lose. And we have a lot to lose. And so there are places in the world that are ready, are putting in things that we would think is offensive. I mean, there will be, in some countries, they've already made commitments, there will be no there'll be no gas fuel, fossil fuel cars. You have to drive electric cars. There are things like that we'll have to learn to live with. So it's a combination of changing the way we live, but also providing technological alternatives that we can still have a good, healthy lifestyle. And you mentioned, joked about the motor vessels and so on. Well, I've always thought, because I do a lot of work at the port and so on, that's, you guys have to think about that, because all these ships coming, and you've got a green port here, but the ships are there's work on electrical vessels, ocean-going vessels, large container carrying barges, electrically powered and things of that sort. Now you still have to worry about how the electricity is generated, but there's a pathway from using just renewable sources to providing transportation, mobile transportation, even in the maritime realm. So,
The Navy's doing that.
Yeah.
right.
Well, we really appreciate your help. That's one last question, but that's it.
All right, thank you. Don, years ago, you had a very compelling presentation about...
As opposed to this one, which
Oh, he got you on that.
Oh, he
man.
got me on that one. This was phenomenal, and updated your past presentations. But, I will say this, that in the State House one time, in the Calvert Room, you gave a very fine presentation on the effect of sea level rise on all the coastal areas in the United States.
Right.
Now, I'm sure you have that updated about Florida and Hatteras and all the different areas. Why couldn't that be used to compel some of these public policy makers in the states to get with it? Because their states are going to be so negatively affected that they're going to lose population, lose land, lose tourism, all these things. But then again, we have what we have in the southern region, which is too bad. I mean,
Well, watch
Governor Scott.
what's going on as an example in my home state, Louisiana.
Yeah, Louisiana,
Where it's a pretty dire situation.
and you've got a Democratic governor.
But even before, even under Jindal, they're developing this plan, they've got 3 scenarios of sea level rise.
Right.
Now, they don't couple it with emissions, because they don't want to go there, but at least they're knowing they're going to be challenged future. And for the first time, there's a state program to help people leave communities and relocate.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, and that's what you're going to see all over.
Oh,
We
yes.
all have to relocate.
And so this is a
I see.
challenge that we have to.
I see. Well, thank you. I hope you'll get that one ready, because
Yeah.
we
If you want
have.
to learn more about, if you want to learn more about sea level rise, and you have to take a course that I teach, and of course you have to pay in-state tuition, which is a lot less than tuition at Hopkins.
Well, sign me up, but I'll tell you, we need you to come here in this county, and we need to get our county council, our city council, and other people who are doing good work here on sea level rise. But some of our public policymakers, you say the state's moving forward with gumballs and so forth, but we have some people with their heads in the sand
Right.
in our location right now, and I want to sign you up for a new
Yeah,
lecture.
I did have a good first meeting with the mayor on these issues.
Good. Okay, good.
By the way, thank you again, but we have one other assignment for you before we close the meeting. I'd like to
I'm a
have
professor, I give the assignment.
Nancy come up. Nancy Haynes from is our new chair for our revenue committee for environmental, and we had a 50-50 raffle today. You have to draw a ticket.
Not too late to buy tickets.
How much are they?
Anne's got the bucket. You got
How much are they?
It's not too late, we can still.
I'll buy a couple.
To,
If Don's gonna pull the thing out of the
We took it
rabbit out of the hat,
$230, so it's $116 the winner will take home tonight. So, Don, you can draw the winner.
nobody else?
I'll buy some.
One extra, oh, all right.
You have change?
While we're
I'll put
doing some
$10.
logistics here, I did want to just announce that, especially since Ben Grumble's name was raised several times tonight, he will be one of our speakers for our series this summer.
Oh,
He is the
good.
Secretary of the Environment,
Right.
and he has been a very progressive Secretary. of the
And I just
Environment.
want to point out that he spoke at the Boomerang
Yes.
race.
He did.
As our guest,
And,
and it was just great when we had our AYC race. It's called Boomerang because it just goes out and it comes back, but the next day we had a great party and Secretary Grumbles was here for that.
Yeah,
So
do
thank
give
you
him
very
your
much
support,
for
because I think he's doing the art of possible.
Hey, Beth.
Yeah.
Are they still,
Well,
did you tell her I want a
Oh,
ticket?
yeah.
Where's our
There's
bucket?
another one.
Wait,
Here's another
here's our
one.
bucket one.
Jane wants to buy it.
Oh my gosh,
How much
look
are
at
they?
your,
$1.